in other parts of the world, namely at the site of Çatalhöyük. So now let's look at the Neolithic in what's now Turkey. So here's the Levant over here. So we looked at the religion here. Now let's move up to this kind of central plains of Anatolia, and there's a site called Çatalhöyük. Çatalhöyük was excavated in the 60s by James Mellert. Up till recently, it was excavated by Ian Hodder from Stanford University. Ian Hodder is one of the people who really kind of pushed through the post-processual archaeology. He believed that in order to interpret ancient religions, you needed to use something besides a scientific approach. It dates to the Pottery Neolithic. So this is when you first have pottery. And the name Çatal in Turkish means fork, and Höyük is a tell, forked mound, because the tell is actually forked into two mounds. You can see here, kind of an east and a west mound. This is what the site looked like in the 60s when Mellert was there. It was fairly dry agricultural wheat fields. Back then, there was much more kind of a marshy area. It was a weather environment. It was a very, you can see, fairly large Neolithic town. Some people call it a city, but it's not quite a city at this point. It's a fairly large town, and it's larger than almost all sites from this time period, right? So it does stand out, and it's unique, and it's very different from many other Neolithic sites. It was agricultural, not surprisingly, the Pottery Neolithic. They found grain storage bins in the houses. They used, domesticated animals and domesticated plants, but as we're going to see, hunting also played an important role. Now, when they've excavated Çatalhöyük, you can see here some of the mud brick houses. When you look at the houses here and the buildings, there seems to be something absent or, in fairly low numbers. When you look at the architecture here, you're only getting the lower level walls preserved, right? But you'll notice there are no streets. All of these houses were agglutinated. That means they were built right up against each other. In order to get from one house to another, you'd have to take a ladder up to the roof, walk along the roofs to another house, and then descend through a hole in the roof. So it might have looked something like this. And again, people ask, why would you build a village like this? You can see this in other parts of the world as well. The Southwest United States and pueblos today, you'll have this kind of architectural structure. Well, why built it this way? Some people again say defense. It's hard for an enemy to attack. That's true, but again, there's no other evidence, as we'll see, for warfare at this site during this time period. Because it was a marshy area, like Jericho, maybe it was for flood control. So this is what Çatalhöyük might have looked like when it was thriving. Houses had rooms for different purposes. Different. You can see some of the rooms were plastered and had images on them. Not in all of the houses, but some of them. We'll talk about this because some people identify these as shrines. You had areas for cooking, areas for food preparation, areas where you would have a pen for your animals, like so. We're going to talk next week as well about pottery, about why it was invented in the first place. In the beginning, it is pretty rare and then becomes more common later on. You can see some of the earliest pottery is pretty crude, but we're going to talk about why pottery might have been invented in the first place, what led up to the development of pottery. You also have fragments of textiles. This is some of the earliest in Anatolia. So we have now production of crafts. Was craft specialized? That is, were a few people doing the crafts because they didn't find textile manufacturing implements in all of the houses. Some people think that maybe only a few people produce textiles, and maybe they were actually specialists. As we said before, you can only have specialization with agriculture, and specialization is a very important part of becoming a complex society. Okay, well now let's talk about the burials from Çatalhöyük. Okay, the burials are interesting. Some houses had multiple burials in them. It looks like certain buildings were used for burials underneath the floors. Not every single house had burials. Some burials were individual, and some burials were in groups, multiple burials, where once someone died, they would open up the floor and bury the next person. We're also going to see that some of these special rooms had painting on them. In one of the rooms, there's a depiction, you can see, of headless people and this large bird above them. What might be going on here? What might be depicted? Well, some people think what's going on is our depiction of vultures picking apart the flesh of corpses. Now, this is a practice that we see in other cultures, sometimes in parts of Nepal, as well as other places, in Tibet. These are known as sky burials. This is a practice where the body of the person who died is laid out, and vultures come and consume the flesh of the person. And this is a respectful way of treating the dead, where the vultures are allowing the soul to escape the body and then ascend up into the heavens. And so this is what might have been going on initially with these burials. They might have laid people out to be consumed by vultures, and then they would bury people underneath the floor. Now, men and women were buried with different things. You can see some of these crazy outfits that they're wearing here in this artist reconstruction are based on some of the paintings that they found on some of the walls in Çatalhöyük. You'll see some of the designs of the people wearing cowhide and leopard skins and things like that. Men were buried mostly with things like weapons, daggers. Women were buried with jewelry and also mirrors, as we'll see. So here you can see a multiple burial. So people would be buried, and then if someone else died, they would remove this floor and bury the next person, then seal it up again. Here's a female burial, and you can see this mirror here that's made out of a black volcanic glass that you probably have heard of before, called obsidian. Now, it turns out that Çatalhöyük was right near a major obsidian source. Obsidian can only appear in areas of volcanic activity, but obsidian was something that was rare. It only exists in two places in the ancient Near East. And also, it's very, very useful. It was very sharp. It made excellent tools. It made things like mirrors. And so it was desired by other people, which meant that it was a good item for trade. And that is something that we actually see at the time of Çatalhöyük. Because obsidian can actually be chemically fingerprinted, they now have been able to determine that there are blades in Jericho, pieces of obsidian Jericho, that came from that source near Çatalhöyük. Now, how did it get there? Did people from Jericho go all the way up to trade and then bring it back down? Did merchants from Çatalhöyük come down and trade with people along the way? It's doubtful, especially when they mapped the distance and the amount of obsidian. You can see that the further you get away from Çatalhöyük, the amount of obsidian drops precipitously. It's like an exponential decrease, not a very slow, gradual decrease. And so they think that what is probably going on here, you can see there's another obsidian source in eastern Turkey. What's going on here is that it's sort of a down-the-line trade. That is, one important village will, Çatalhöyük will trade to its neighbors. The neighbors will keep some obsidian and then trade some to the next group. Those people will trade some and then, and keep the rest for themselves. And the more it gets down and further away from Çatalhöyük, the more it decreases very, very rapidly with distance. So it's probably a down the line trade. It's not a kind of colonial trade as we're going to see later on with Mesopotamia. But this is one of the earliest widely traded commodities in the ancient world, obsidian. And we'll see that things like obsidian make good trade goods. Why? Because they have a high value compared to their weight and their bulk. The best trade goods are things that are small, low bulk, and high value. The worst trade goods are things that are very bulky and not very valuable. Okay, so obsidian exchange made Çatalhöyük fairly important economically. Not only, are they a fairly large site, but they're also sitting right near this resource that other people want. Another thing that makes Çatalhöyük stand out are what are known as shrines. Now, shrines are different from temples, as we're going to see. At Göbekli Tepe, we saw public central areas that were ritual. Shrines are located inside of people's houses. They're domestic. It's usually one room in a house that has this sort of feature. So let's take a little look at what was found inside the shrines. Looking at a map of Çatalhöyük, you can see that between buildings there were open courts where garbage was disposed, and you can see the little S's here. That not all of the buildings, the pink ones you can see in the map here, had shrines. The white ones did not have shrines. James Mellor, who excavated the site in the 60s, thought that about a third to a half of the buildings actually had shrines. So how do they identify them as shrines? These were houses where a room was elaborately decorated, usually with wall paintings and also with other features, as we're going to see, such as plastered bulls' skulls on the wall or other plaster images of animals. This is one painting. We saw the earlier painting of the vultures eating those human corpses. This painting seems to show the site of Çatalhöyük itself, and you can see the volcano in the background. There actually was some volcanic ash that was found in the site. As we said, obsidian is nearby. Obsidian is a volcanic material. There's an inactive volcano near the site. And also some of these paintings had geometric designs as well. This is James Mellor trying to peel back some of the plaster carefully from, some of the soil carefully from the walls to reveal the painting underneath. He stopped work in the 60s, and since about 2000 and so till pretty recently, Ian Hodder has excavated there. There's a website for the site, çatalhöyük.com, I think, or org. I think çatalhöyük.org, and it has some of the papers they've published on the site. So he continued what Mellor started, but as we'll talk about, did it in using some of the advanced technology of the 2000s and 2010s. Okay, a lot of the depictions of animals are of wild animals. In fact, all of them are of wild animals. You're going to be doing a little bit of reading on Çatalhöyük for a discussion this weekend, and you'll be trying, to discuss what exactly these representations mean, what was the religion like at Çatalhöyük. But you can see hunting scenes. This is probably a leopard. You can see people hunting deer over here. And one of the most important animals is the wild bull, sometimes referred to by scientists as the aurochs. Now here you can see, not to scale, humans or people hunting this wild bull. The wild bull's shown much larger than it would be in real life, but we said wild bulls are fairly large. Now, what does the wild bull represent? Well, that's a good question. In many cultures, bulls represent male fertility. Is that what's going on here? It's hard to tell. Is it sort of a symbol of the wild? That's also a good question. Here's some more. You can see geometric designs. When they looked at the actual diet of the people, right, what they found is that people were mainly eating sheep and goat. Right? The animals that they're depicting on the walls are not the animals that are forming the main part of their subsistence. So these animals are ritually important, but they're not necessarily important in terms of subsistence. Yes, they are eating some of these wild animals, but the majority of their food is coming from sheep and goat. All right, and some of these shrines, they would take bulls' skulls and cover them in plaster and then affix them to the wall like so. You know, like all the rooms in Çatalhöyük, you had to descend a ladder through the roof to get down into the shrine, where certain buildings important to certain family groups. We're not exactly sure. Some people believe that because Çatalhöyük was so large and it had all these shrines, it might have been a kind of almost like a pilgrimage site for the area. People would have come to Çatalhöyük at different times of the year. Here we can see a plastered bench showing bull's horns on either side. These are leopards. You can see with the spots over here, there were leopards, wild leopards in this part of Turkey during the Pottery Neolithic. There's another depiction of the shrines, and you can see another one here. Then there are these features that you'll read about, I think, which Ian Hodder identified as breasts. There are these knobs of plaster. Some of them have vulture skulls or the jaws of boars inside of them. And Hodder has his own interpretation of what that might actually mean. Here's another, what's called a bucrania, bull's skull plastered on the wall. There are also female figures. So you can see these female figures right here. One is sitting between two lions. What do these female figurines actually represent? Well, you know, some people think fertility, that these might have been pregnant women, or representations of female fertility. One of these fertility figurines, if they are actually fertility figurines, was found in a granary, maybe to ensure an abundant harvest. And so some people think that maybe something's going on with, worship of female fertility and male fertility. And again, maybe Çatalhöyük was using religion to bring people together, much like was going on at Göbekli Tepe. Were these actual individual portraits of people, or were they symbolic of fertility in general? That's a good question. As you'll read about, Ian Hodder has his own ideas. He believes that there's sort of dichotomies that are being represented at Çatalhöyük, like men and women, life and death, domestic and wild. So these sort of contrasting elements, and some of them are worshipped and are being represented in Çatalhöyük. You'll also have the beginnings of sealings. These are pieces of clay or pieces of stone that could be pushed into wet clay to create a seal. That's something that we'll talk more about throughout the semester. These become very important throughout Mesopotamian history. You could see a finely made flint dagger, right, with a stone handle, and these kind of stone beads. It looks like we have the beginnings of craft specialization, because these things are so finely made. They were probably made by a specialist who could be freed up from working in the fields by surplus food, and who could trade their goods for the food that they needed. As you know, we'll talk more about specialization throughout the semester. Okay, based on some of the wall paintings, this is what Ian Hodder and his team think that some of the clothing styles of men and women might have actually looked like, and hairstyles. And you can see a little depiction here. So maybe keeping some animals in some of these. You can see areas between parts of the building, so sort of a low-lying empty area with a gate over here. Okay, here's again another one of those shrines. They found garbage, as we said before, in some of the empty areas. People were just throwing their garbage right, going to the roof, dumping it right in the empty space in between the buildings. What Ian Hodder and his team have done to look at the different activities that might have gone on in different parts of the room is they have looked at what's known as micro debris. They've actually excavated portions of the plaster floor, and as you saw again in that film at Ein Gazal, plaster is an artificial substance, and it's very labor intensive to make and also requires a lot of fuel to make. You're crushing limestone, you're heating it with water, and you're producing a synthetic substance. So as people are using the house in Çatalhöyük, and let's say maybe making some flint tools, maybe butchering an animal in another area, tiny fragments might get pushed into the lime plaster, and you can recover those small fragments by excavating portions of the floor. You can also do chemical analyses on the floor because organic materials might leave behind some residue. So you could identify what they were doing in different areas, like storing in one area, cooking in another, maybe preparing food in another place, right? So, for example, here you can see, plant is number 1, bone, obsidian, and the total of all the materials in 4. So here you can see here lots of bone. Here's a little bit of bone in this area. It looks like highest concentration of bone is over here. That may be where they were butchering the animal, and then things got scattered a little bit to these other areas. Right? Okay, so lots of different activities going on in these buildings at Çatalhöyük. Right. Around, a little bit before, so going back in time a little bit to the PPNB, like you read about with Göbekli Tepe. After Göbekli Tepe, so here's Çatalhöyük over here, but going back in time just a little bit to the PPNB, right? After Göbekli Tepe is abandoned, similar T-shaped pillars and similar designs and similar animal motifs are represented at a nearby site called Navali Chori, up just a little bit north. So it seems like that religious practice continues in that part of Turkey. Right? Okay, so we see a similarity between some of the Göbekli Tepe iconography and some of the iconography at Çatalhöyük. Not exactly the same. We're seeing a variety of different religious practices in the Levant. We're seeing ancestor worship, something else going on in Çatalhöyük, and something different going on over here. So that's something that we're going to keep in mind as we progress. The next thing that we're going to look at is the very beginnings of complex societies. So some of you may have taken Origins of Civilization. If you have, the next part will be a little bit of a review, but it's good to review. We're going to talk about bands, tribes, chiefdoms, and states, and talk about what comprises a complex society.